There is a kind of silence that has nothing to do with noise. It is the silence of a person who has finally decided, after a very long time, to stop pretending they did not hear, to stop pretending they did not see, to stop folding themselves small enough to fade into the walls of a house that was never truly theirs. That kind of silence is heavy. It grows for years. And when it finally breaks, when the person carrying it finds a way to release it, the sound it makes can travel farther than a scream, farther than a gunshot, farther than anything else, because it moves through paper. What you are about to hear is the account of a woman named Dora. She was a cook on a sugar plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s. She spent almost 20 years feeding a family that never once learned her last name. She stirred their pots, salted their meat, and listened to every word spoken inside that house. Because when you are treated like furniture, people forget you are even in the room. They told her nothing. They told her everything. And one night in the summer of 1857, for reasons historians and archivists have argued about ever since, a bundle of handwritten pages was found inside the false bottom of an oak chest in 1923. Dora had written it all down. Every secret, every name, every night she had pretended not to hear. This is her story. Stay with it until the end, because the most disturbing thing about what happened at Belhaven Plantation is not what Dora witnessed. It is what happened to the people who later discovered she had written it down. The Belhaven Plantation stood 12 miles south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on land that had been cleared, drained, and forced into productivity through decades of labor that its owner, Gerald Hatfield, preferred not to think about directly. He thought about the harvest instead. He thought about the price of sugar in New Orleans, about the weight of barrels, about changing weather patterns and the condition of the cane. He was a man who had trained himself to see the business without seeing the human machinery that kept it running. The way a person can look at a clock, read the time, and never once consider the gears inside it. Gerald was 53 years old in the summer of 1857. He had the wide, sunburned face of a man who spent too many hours on horseback under a southern sun, and too many evenings on his veranda with a glass of bourbon. He was not cruel in the sense of taking pleasure in cruelty. He was something more ordinary and in many ways more dangerous. He was a man who simply did not look. He did not look closely at the people who worked for him. He did not examine the accounts his overseer kept in the gray ledger. He did not study the faces of the women who carried his meals from the separate kitchen house, through the garden, and up the back steps into his dining room. Dora had been making that walk for 18 years. She had been brought to Belhaven in 1839 when she was about 19 years old. The records from the estate where she had previously lived were incomplete, as records for enslaved people often were, more detailed about livestock than about human lives. She arrived at the plantation already knowing how to cook. Her former mistress had kept a kitchen that demanded accuracy, and Dora had learned that the kitchen was a place where skill could buy a quiet kind of authority. A cook who made poor meals was punished. A cook who made excellent ones was often left alone to continue making them. She understood very early that excellence could serve as armor. By 1857, Dora was somewhere in her middle to late 30s. She managed the plantation kitchen with the calm efficiency of a woman who understood that the only space truly available to her was the one she carved out with her own ability. The kitchen house was a separate building behind the main house, a common design on Louisiana plantations, partly for the practical reason of keeping cooking fires away from the main structure, and partly for the social reason of keeping the people who prepared the food at a visible distance from those who ate it. The kitchen stood about 40 feet from the rear entrance of the main house. Between them was a covered walkway, a pergola thick with jasmine that bloomed white and sweet from April through October. Dora walked that path many times each day, and what mattered, though no one who designed the house had considered it, was that the rear windows of Gerald Hatfield's study sat directly above the back steps, where the path ended. Gerald conducted much of his private business in that study. He kept the windows open because the Louisiana summer heat was relentless, and because after 18 years he had completely stopped noticing Dora's presence in tea. The same way a person stops noticing the steady ticking of a clock in a room they have slept in for years. This was his most serious mistake. Dora had been born into a world that required her to make constant, fast calculations about what she knew, what she could say, and what she was expected to pretend not to know. This was not unique to her. It was the specific intelligence the system demanded from people in her position, a kind of endless, exhausting alertness that went unrecognized because it was invisible, and because admitting it existed would have forced the people around her to acknowledge it. She knew things about the Hatfield family that they believed were private. She knew that Gerald's eldest son, Philip, 26, handsome in the easy way of men who have always been called handsome and have never had to think about it, was 3 months behind on debts he had built up in New Orleans that his father knew nothing about. She knew this because Philip had received 2 letters that spring, and she had been standing at the base of the main staircase when he read them. The sound a man makes when he reads something that frightens him is unmistakable, and she had listened carefully. She knew that Gerald's wife Cecily, a thin, exact woman from a Virginia family that once had more land and reputation than money, and who had spent 20 years married to Gerald while quietly managing what she saw as a social disappointment, had been writing letters to her sister in Richmond that she did not send through the usual post. Instead, she sent them through a trusted friend in Baton Rouge, who mailed them from there. Cecily had mentioned this arrangement in a soft conversation with that friend in the parlor one afternoon, speaking in the lowered tones that polite Southern women used when they wished to be discreet, not realizing that lowered voices in a house with wooden floors and high ceilings traveled differently than expected, and that Dora had been in the hallway outside the door with a tray in her hands. She knew that Gerald's younger son, Robert, 19, narrow-shouldered and carrying a nervous intelligence that made others slightly uneasy, had been spending time in parts of the parish his father would not approve of, meeting with people his father would never welcome, and reading documents that could have created serious trouble for the entire family had they reached the attention of certain men in Baton Rouge. She knew all of this the way a river knows the curve of its banks, quietly and continuously, without being asked. And she kept it the way water keeps the shape of a container, perfectly and without effort. For 18 years, what Dora knew remained inside her. It had no release. It had nowhere to go. She was a cook on a plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s, and the idea that she might share what she knew with anyone who could use it was so impossible that it barely formed as a thought. It was simply weight, something she carried. Until the summer of 1857, when 3 things happened in quick succession that changed what she carried from simple weight into something sharper, something dangerous. The first event came in June. A man arrived at Belhaven who had not been expected. His name was Cyrus Holt, and he described himself as a business associate of Gerald Hatfield from Memphis, come south on a matter requiring discretion. He rode in on a Tuesday afternoon with a leather satchel that he kept close at all times, and with a manner that Dora, who had long experienced distinguishing between men who were comfortable, immediately recognized as the second kind. Gerald received Cyrus Holt in his study with the windows open, because it was June in Louisiana, and the alternative was suffocation. Dora walked the jasmine path 3 times that afternoon. She did not slow her steps. She did not deliberately pause beneath the window. She simply moved at her normal pace, carrying what she was meant to carry. And she listened to what the open window allowed her to hear, because she had learned long ago that the best way to gather information was never to appear to be trying. What she heard, in pieces carried by the air as she passed beneath the window, rather than standing still, was enough. Cyrus Holt had come about a debt, not Philip's debt, which was the careless debt of a young man who drank too freely and gambled poorly. This was another kind of debt, larger and more serious. Gerald Hatfield had, it seemed, entered into an agreement years earlier with a group of men whose business interests were, in the language of 1857 Louisiana, irregular. The arrangement had been profitable for a time. It was no longer profitable, and the men Cyrus Holt represented were not known for patience. And the number that drifted through the open window and reached Dora's ears as she passed beneath it was large enough that she felt something unexpected. She felt fear for the family, not because she loved them. It was more complicated than love. It was the fear of someone bound to a household, the quiet understanding that if the house collapses, everyone inside it falls in different ways, but everyone falls all the same. She carried the food inside and said nothing. The second event took place in early July. It involved Robert. For the past year, Robert Hatfield had been quietly and carefully involved in something that, in 1857, Louisiana was not only socially frowned upon, but truly dangerous. He had been attending meetings, not political meetings in any official sense. No, the sort of gatherings that men of his family's position attended in town, with others of equal standing, to discuss crop yields, tariffs, and market prices. These were different meetings, small assemblies in back rooms and private houses, the kind that left no public record and were mentioned in letters only in indirect language that required shared understanding to interpret. Dora had known about Robert's activities for several months. She had noticed the looks he exchanged with certain visitors. She had paid attention to which letters he opened before showing them to his father, and which ones he quietly slipped into his pocket. She had observed the pattern of his absences. But in early July, something shifted. A man came to the back of the kitchen house, not to the front entrance, not by the proper path that any respectable visitor would use, but through the vegetable garden in the late evening, when the light was fading and the household was settling into its nightly routines. He was a thin man, older than Robert, with rough hands and a slow, careful manner of moving. He had come to speak to Dora, not about Robert directly, but about something Robert was carrying. The man did not give his name, and Dora did not ask, because she understood that in such conversations names were dangerous things. He explained that Robert had taken something he should not have taken, something entrusted to the movement Robert had joined, and that this item needed to be returned or passed along, without going through Robert, who in recent weeks had become unreliable in ways that troubled those depending on him. The man asked Dora if she would help. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the jasmine path, the open window, and 18 years of walking quietly, hearing everything, and carrying it alone. She told him she would think about it. The man left the way he had come, through the vegetable garden. Dora remained in her kitchen for a long time afterward, listening to the house settle in the heavy heat. She was thinking, but she was also, for the first time in many years, remembering what it felt like to be asked. The third event happened in the middle of July. It was the one that changed everything. It began with a conversation she was not meant to hear, in a room she was not supposed to be near. At a time when everyone in the main house believed she was in the kitchen, she was not there. She was standing at the bottom of the back staircase, having come up through the rear entrance to replace the candles in the hallway sconces, a task she usually completed in the afternoon, but had delayed because of preparations for a dinner Gerald Hatfield was hosting that evening. It was after 4 o'clock. The hallway was dim, the shutters partly closed again. Soot, the afternoon heat. The study door was not fully latched. Gerald and Cyrus Holt were inside. Cyrus had not left after his June visit. He had stayed, which was unusual, and his continued presence had created a quiet tension in the household that had been building for weeks. Gerald had told Cecily that Holt was assisting with business matters, and Cecily, whose intelligence was strong, but whose access to her husband's affairs was structurally limited, had accepted this explanation with the expression of a woman who has learned not to ask questions and has trained herself not to regret not asking them. But that afternoon, through the partly open study door, what Dora heard was not about the debt she already knew existed. It was about a man living in Baton Rouge, a man who, according to Cyrus Holt, was asking questions he should not be asking. He had begun making inquiries about a series of transactions linking Gerald Hatfield to a group of men represented by Holt. These transactions had taken place over several years and involved matters that, if revealed properly to the right people, would completely ruin Gerald Hatfield and implicate several other men of similar standing in the parish. Cyrus Holt spoke in a voice that was calm and exact, explaining what he believed should be done about this man. Gerald did not answer at once. There was a long silence. Then he said so, nothing in a voice so low that Dora, at the bottom of the stairs, caught only part of it. The part she heard was enough. She stood, very still. She finished replacing the candles. She walked back down the hallway and out through the rear entrance, along the jasmine path to the kitchen house. She fed the fire beneath the pot for the evening meal. She stirred. She added salt. She thought about the man in Baton Rouge asking dangerous questions. She thought about the man who had come through the vegetable garden and asked for her help. She thought about Philip's debts, Cecily's hidden letters, Robert's risky meetings, and 18 years of knowing, carrying, and remaining silent. And quietly in the back of her mind, she began to arrange it all. If you have been listening this far, stay with us, because what Dora had gathered over 18 years was about to become the most dangerous inventory imaginable. And this is only the beginning. The truth about being invisible in a house is that you are not truly unseen. You are simply categorized differently. You are furniture. You are an appliance. You are part of the mechanism. And mechanisms are not expected to observe, so no one considers that they do. Dora had been observing since 1839. She possessed a memory she had never been credited for because she had never been given a chance to demonstrate it. She could recall conversations from years earlier with the accuracy of a court stenographer, the exact words, the precise tone, the meaningful silences between sentences that sometimes carried more weight than speech itself. This was not a talent she had shaped for any special purpose. It was a skill developed the way anyone develops something that keeps them safe, out of necessity. By the summer of 1857, consider what Dora knew. She understood the full structure of Gerald Havfield's financial life, not because anyone had explained it to her, but because financial worry is one of the loudest forces in a household. It reveals itself in the kind of meals requested, in the length of private discussions in the study after supper, in the way a man's shoulders settle when he sits at the dinner table. She had watched Gerald's body tell the story his mouth refused to speak for years. She knew Belhaven had been mortgaged in 1853. She knew because she overheard Gerald dictating a letter to his clerk that spring and saw the clerk's expression when he returned to the plantation 3 days after mailing it. When a man's face looks the way that clerk's face looked, the news is never good. She knew the sugar yields had been declining since 1854. She understood this from dinner conversations, from the difference in Gerald's tone when yields were strong, expansive, and proud, equating the land's production with his own way. Off, compared to recent years when he spoke briefly, almost dismissively, shifting the subject to other matters. She knew Gerald had been hosting men from New Orleans who were not his usual guests. She had served them. She had studied them. They wore fine clothing and had the manners of men used to being accommodated. But beneath those manners there was something else, a patience not of men waiting for success, but of men certain of an outcome. Over time she had learned to tell the difference. These men from New Orleans had visited several times between 1853 and 1856. After 1856, they stopped coming to Belhaven. Instead, Cyrus Holt began arriving. Dora did not overlook this change. What Dora understood about Philip was at its heart the story of a young man given everything except the ability to manage it. Philip Havfield had grown up as heir to the plantation, the status and the social position that came with owning land and being white in mid-19th century Louisiana. He had grown up expecting these things, and that expectation had given him a confidence that seemed real but was hollow, like a building that appears strong from the outside while its inner beams are weakened. Philip had traveled to New Orleans at 18 and returned altered, not in obvious ways his parents would quickly detect, but changed in the way someone changes after discovering something out themselves, that their family's world has no language to explain. Dora noticed it immediately. She saw it in the way he ate quickly, as if meals were interruptions, and in the restless way he moved through the house, always appearing to be on his way somewhere else, always ready to leave. He had been traveling to New Orleans regularly ever since. He brought home gifts for his mother, explanations for his father, and debts that increased with each visit with the steady certainty of compound interest. The men he owed were not men who would wait forever. Dora understood this not from overhearing direct conversations, but from the nature of the letters that arrived for Philip, the ones he read and burned immediately instead of leaving on his desk. She knew letters had been burned because she cleaned the fireplaces and burned paper leaves a distinct kind of ash. By July of 1857, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Ash in Philip's fireplace was building up at a pace that told its own quiet story. Cecily Havfield was the most complicated person in Dora's world, and the one she had spent the greatest amount of time thinking about. She was not a cruel woman. Dora had decided that years earlier, with the calm objectivity of someone who has had plenty of time and closeness to form a judgment. Cecily was a woman who made her choices within the narrow range allowed to women of age, status in her era, and she made them efficiently and without open regret, which is not the same as making them with joy. She managed the household with a precision that almost crossed into obsession. Every surface in the main house was kept at a standard that demanded constant labor from the people responsible for it. She hosted gatherings with a politeness that guests remembered and commented on. She dressed with care and spoke with care and handled the family's social connections with the strategic focus of a diplomat. Yet she was not content. Dora understood this the way she understood most things about the family, through closeness and steady observation. She knew it from the way Cecily sat at the breakfast table, after Gerald had already left for the morning. The specific stillness that settled over her, the way she held her coffee cup in both hands and stared out at the garden without truly seeing what was in front of her. The letters to her sister in Richmond were the most revealing detail about Cecily, and also the most dangerous, because the sister in Richmond was not replying through the usual channels either. The letters that arrived from Richmond, addressed in handwriting that Cecily always took directly into her own hands, never leaving them on the front table where the rest of the mail was sorted, were not ordinary messages. Dora did not know their full meaning. She did not make a habit of reading letters that were not hers, and in any case, Cecily guarded her correspondence in a way that made access nearly impossible. But Dora understood something of their meaning from Cecily's reactions. From the way her posture shifted after reading them, the way she sometimes walked straight to the writing desk in the parlor and began writing immediately, with a speed and force different from her usual careful letters. The sister in Richmond was helping Cecily prepare something. Dora did not know what it was, but she had been watching the pattern for nearly a year, and in her experience, patterns always turned into something clear eventually. Robert worried her the most, not only because of the danger of what he was involved in, though that danger was real, and she saw it plainly. What troubled her about Robert was more exact, the distance between his intelligence and his judgment. He was truly a bright young man. She had noticed this from his childhood in the way he read constantly and seriously, not pretending literacy for social appearance, but actually absorbing ideas. He grew up in a house where the library was full and mostly decorative, yet he had read a large portion of it by the time he was 15. That was how he found the ideas that slowly and completely reshaped how he understood the world he had been born into. The problem was that his intelligence had moved faster than his caution. He had connected himself with people doing serious and dangerous work, people who operated with careful secrecy shaped by a deep awareness of consequences. Robert had come to these beliefs through books rather than lived experience, and he had not yet developed that deep instinct about what exposure could cost. He was careful in the way someone is careful when they understand a rule in theory, not the way someone is careful after witnessing what happens to those who break it. The man who had passed through the vegetable garden in July had said Robert was becoming unreliable. He did not explain further, but Dora understood the meaning in that context. Unreliable did not mean unfaithful. It meant careless. And careless in 1857, Louisiana was a word that carried consequences far beyond the careless person. She watched Robert at dinner in the weeks after that visit. She watched how he listened when his father spoke, with a contained intensity that Gerald likely mistook for simple attention, but which Dora recognized as something else. She noticed the moments when he looked down at his plate instead of meeting his father's eyes, when certain remarks were made. The tight control over an expression that wanted to shift. He was moving towards something. She could sense it the way you sense a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. She did not know whether, when it came, it would break cleanly or shatter everything. What happened next is the part that explains why this story remained hidden for 60 years, and why, when it was finally uncovered, the people who discovered it were unsure whether they should have. Dora could not read. This must be stated clearly because it changes the meaning of what she eventually did, and because the act itself, the act of writing it down, required something she did not normally possess. In 1857, she had never been taught to read. This was deliberate. Louisiana, like other slaveholding states, had laws forbidding the formal education of enslaved people. Those laws reflected a clear understanding by the lawmakers that literacy was power, and power was exactly what the system refused to grant to those it enslaved. Still, Dora had learned things. She learned the way a person learns in a world that officially denies knowledge, indirectly through closeness, through the human ability to absorb more than others assume. She could not read a full page smoothly, but she could read enough. Over years in the kitchen, she learned her letters from household papers left nearby, menus written in Cecily's neat handwriting, lists, notes, labels on jars. She matched these with the sounds she heard, the way a child learns language before formal lessons, through pattern and repetition. She could write her own name. She learned that in her previous household from another woman who had learned it the same hidden way. She could write around 40 words with fair confidence. Words she practiced in the ashes of the kitchen hearth when alone. Words taken from labels, lists, and small scraps of paper that passed through her hands. It was not enough to write a full account, but it was not her only resource. There was a boy named Lenny. He was 14 in the summer of 1857 and worked in the Hatfield stables. He was small for his age, quick-moving, and had a focused attention that, in another world, might have been called academic. He learned to read through a method common and officially unseen on plantations. He listened to the tutor teaching the Hatfield children, standing outside the schoolroom window while pretending to handle tasks, and he listened for years with steady patience. He was better at it than Dora had been. He had started younger. Dora had known about Lenny's literacy for about 3 years. She knew because she had seen him reading, truly reading. Not pretending, not holding a book upside down or turning pages randomly, but reading with moving eyes and lips shaping words, his face reacting to meaning. She saw this twice when he thought no one was watching. She told no one. She simply remembered and waited. In late summer 1857, she told Lenny what she read. Quiet. She chose her words carefully. She understood the weight of what she was asking, not only the risk of the action, but the risk of placing any part of that burden on a 14-year-old boy. She considered it for days before speaking. She searched for another solution. She found none. One evening, after the main house had gone to supper, she went to the stables. She explained clearly and directly what she needed him to do. She did not lessen the danger. She did not pretend it was simple. She looked at him in a way adults in that household rarely did, directly and with respect. And she gave him the choice. He agreed. Then he looked at her with serious, alert eyes and asked, "Where will we get the paper?" Paper in a plantation house was controlled. It was kept in the study, in Cecily's writing desk, in the parlor, in the schoolroom. Taking enough for Dora's purpose would be noticed. It took 2 weeks to solve this. The answer came from the supply room inventory. Dora managed it and kept the basic written records, a practical exception made because the kitchen required written accounting for the overseer, and since Dora ran the kitchen, she maintained the list. The records were simple, and the paper she used was rough wrapping paper, not the fine stationery from the study. But it was still paper. She began saving it slowly, 1 or 2 sheets at a time across 2 weeks in August. She adjusted the inventory entries carefully, spacing them so the totals appeared correct when checked. It was a small and careful deception, the kind she was capable of, because 18 years of close attention had taught her exactly how often the supply lists were reviewed, by whom, and with what seriousness. By mid-August, she had enough dot paper. The ink created a separate difficulty, handled in a more direct way. Lenny took a small bottle of writing ink from the schoolroom supply cupboard and replaced it with another bottle of similar size that he had filled with water colored with kitchen blacking. The switch was not perfect, but it would not be noticed quickly, and quickly was all they required. They were prepared. She did not write it with her own hand. This is important to understand. Dora spoke the words and Lenny wrote. They worked in the kitchen house after the main house had gone to sleep, which in summer in Louisiana meant well after 10 o'clock, when the heat of the day finally began to loosen its hold, and the house settled into the soft sounds of night, the creak of beds, the faint sound of Gerald's light snoring drifting through the open windows, and at last, the silence when even the dogs stopped moving. The first night they sat for almost an hour without speaking, while Dora gathered her thoughts. She had never done anything like this before. She had ideas, she had memories, she had 18 years of stored knowledge. But turning that into something ordered and written down was different from simply knowing it, and she needed time to understand the shape she would give it. Lenny waited with the patience of a boy who had spent years doing exactly that. Waiting, watching, staying still long enough for the world to show him more than it meant to reveal. At last, she began. She did not begin with the most shocking part. She began at the start, with what she had seen in the first years after she arrived, the shape of the household as she first understood it, the personalities as they first showed themselves to her. This was a deliberate choice, and it revealed something about the way she thought. It made what followed clearer and more terrible, because by the time she reached the events of 1857, the reader would understand how each person had come to stand in the place they now occupied. She spoke in a low and steady voice. Lenny wrote fast in handwriting that was not beautiful but easy to read, the writing of someone self-taught and practical, focused on clarity rather than style. They worked for about 2 hours that first night. Then Dora stood, stretched her back, hid the pages beneath the loose board in the kitchen floor where she kept the few small possessions that belonged to her, and returned to her sleeping place. They repeated this for 9 nights. 9 nights. The kitchen house had no clock, yet Dora carried an inner sense of time that was rarely wrong by more than 15 minutes. It was a skill formed over years of managing the exact timing that cooking demands. She knew how long each night's work lasted. By the 4th night, she understood they had covered about half of what she needed to tell. By the 7th night, she knew they were nearing the part that was most dangerous to put into words. She did not hesitate. She had already decided on the first night that if she was going to do this at all, she would do it fully. A partial truth, she knew, was only a more complicated form of silence, and she had been silent long enough. So she told Lenny about the conversation she had overheard through the study window. In June, she told him about Cyrus Holt and the nature of the debt, about the men from New Orleans, and about the number that had drifted through the open window and settled in her mind like something caught in a trap that could not be released. She told him about the man who had walked through the vegetable garden asking about Robert. She described the conversation at the foot of the staircase, the words spoken through the unlatched study door, and what they suggested about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions, and what Cyrus Holt believed should be done about him. Lenny's hands slowed when she reached this section, not because he struggled to write, but because he was thinking about what he was putting on the page, and that thinking required a pause that his hand could not hide. She waited. He looked up at her. She met his eyes. She said, "Keep writing." He continued. She also told Lenny things she had never spoken aloud before. She told him about a death. In 1851, a man named Terence died on the Belhaven plantation. He had been one of the field workers, a man in his 40s who had lived there for years, respected among the others in the quarters, and who in the year before he died had held certain information that Dora knew about and believed had played some indirect but real role in what happened to him. She had no proof. She made that clear as she dictated. She said, "I do not know it as fact. I know it as something that feels wrong inside me." But she placed it in the pages anyway, because she believed that even what is only partly known deserves to be spoken when the other choice is that it remains unspoken forever. She told him about a woman named Addie who had been sold from Belhaven in 1848 under circumstances that any official record, if it existed, would have described in the neutral language of property transfer. What those records would never show was the reason. What they would never record was the conversation Dora overheard 2 weeks before the sale, in the study through the open window as she walked along the jasmine path. She had carried Addie's story for 9 years. She placed it into the pages. She told him about the visiting men from New Orleans, not only that they came, but what she had noticed about them, the quality of their patience, the way they looked at the plantation and its people differently from how planters or business partners usually look at property, a look that told her something about the nature of the agreement, though she could not have clearly named it then. She described a document she had seen, not read fully, because she could not read all of it, but observed carefully enough to explain its appearance, the letterhead, the signature at the bottom, the arrangement of the text in a way she believed, combined with what she had heard, would make sense to someone able to read it. She explained the small and steady ways in which the plantation's accounting over the years had been arranged to present a picture slightly but consistently different from the truth she lived each day. She spoke of a man named August Fry. It was a name Dora had heard only once in passing, during a conversation between Gerald Hatfield and a stranger who had arrived at the plantation in late winter of 1855. She had been walking the Jasmine Path, as she often did, sometimes feeling that the most important geography of the entire plantation was those 40 feet of covered walkway. The name had drifted down from the open study window with the weight of something carefully measured before being spoken. Gerald said the name once. The other man answered. Then Gerald used the word arrangement. After that, they either moved farther into the room or lowered their voices enough that the path offered nothing more. Dora kept the name August Fry. She did not know who he was or what the arrangement meant, but she had learned that names spoken in that tone, in that company, deserved to be remembered. She had learned that sometimes the value of something is not clear until later, until it joins with something else, like two simple ingredients creating something entirely new. She placed the name into the pages. She could not know then whether August Fry would matter, but she trusted the weight she had felt. On the 9th night she dictated the final section. Its tone was different, not gentler, but more personal. She instructed Lenny to write her exact words, without correcting or improving them, even if they did not sound like the language of a book. She said, "My name is Dora. I have lived on this plantation for 18 years. Everything written here is true as I understand truth, which is what I have seen with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. The law would not give so, me and like me any authority, and I understand what that means for these pages. But I write them because keeping important things inside, when they involve harm done to people, is its own kind of harm. I have been careful all my life. Tonight, I choose something other than careful." She paused. Lenny waited. She continued, "Whoever finds this, think about all the things never written because the person who knew them was never meant to know how to write. Think about all the pages that were never created. I created these. That is what I can do." She sat quietly for a moment after finishing. Then she said, "Add the date." Lenny wrote the date, August 22nd, 1857. Dora had decided weeks before they began writing where the pages would be hidden. The chest had stood in the kitchen house since before her arrival at Belhaven. It was an old oak chest, heavy and marked by years of use and rough handling, used to store dry goods, beans, rice, and supplies that lasted long, and had to be protected from rats. It was not locked because it held nothing the main household believed valuable enough to secure. Inside, a thick wooden divider sat about 2/3 of the way down, forming an upper space reached through the lid and a lower space that appeared from outside to be nothing more than the solid base of the chest that appeared, at first glance, to be the solid bottom of the chest. It was not the solid bottom at all. Someone had altered it. She did not know who had done it or when the change had been made. The panel was not clearly removable, not in any way that would catch attention unless a person already knew to search for it. But it could be lifted. The panel was not nailed down. It simply rested on a narrow wooden ridge that circled the inside of the chest, held in place by its own weight and by whatever was stored on top of it. Remove those items, raise the panel, and there was a hollow space underneath, about 4 inches deep, stretching across the full inside length and width of the chest, completely invisible to anyone who was not deliberately looking for it. Dora had discovered this hidden space in her second year at Belhaven, when she dropped a dried bean that rolled away and slipped behind the panel. She reached in to get it back, and her hand found the empty space. She told no one about it. She set the panel back in place, poured the beans back over it, and kept the knowledge to herself. For 15 years that space had remained unused. Now it would hold the pages. She wrapped the pages in a piece of oiled cloth she had saved from a supply delivery, the type of cloth used to wrap tools for storage, meant to protect against dampness, which was unavoidable in a Louisiana kitchen. She folded the cloth carefully around the papers, tied it securely with a piece of kitchen twine, and placed the bundle into the space beneath the panel. Then she lowered the panel back into position, set the sacks of dried rice and beans on top again, and closed the lid. She stood looking at the chest for a moment. She felt something she did not quite have a name for. It was not exactly relief, not exactly satisfaction, not exactly fear, but some mixture of all three, and yet none of them fully. It was the feeling that comes after doing something that cannot be undone, when you have already decided that undoing was never the goal. Then, she went to bed. September arrived in the way Louisiana Septembers do, not with real coolness, since that was still weeks away, but with a change in the quality of light. The angle shifted slightly, stretching the afternoon shadows longer, and giving the evenings a sense that something was drawing to a close. Dora watched the household closely during the first days of September. She watched because things had been shifting since Cyrus Holt's arrival, and the change was gaining speed. She sensed it in the tone of conversations at the dinner table. Gerald spoke more carefully than usual, selecting his words with a precision that was different from his normal straightforward manner. The careful speech of a man deciding what to reveal, and to whom. She noticed it in Philip's growing absences, which were happening more often and with fewer explanations. She saw it in Cecily's posture during meals, the straight and steady posture of a woman preparing herself for something. Most of all, she felt it in Robert, who had grown very quiet over the past 2 weeks. Robert's silence was not the quiet of someone at ease. It was the silence of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the right time to act. She recognized that kind of silence because she had lived inside it herself all summer. On the 5th of September, a letter arrived for Gerald Haverfield. She did not see its contents, but she knew. It was important because of what followed. Gerald received it in the morning, read it alone in his study with the door shut, and then went to find Cyrus Holt, who was staying in the guest room at the back of the main house. She knew Gerald had gone to Holt because she heard his steps on the rear staircase. After 18 years in the house, she could identify each member of the family by the sound of their footsteps. She heard him knock, enter, and close the door. The conversation lasted about 40 minutes. When Gerald came out, he went straight to the stables and asked for a horse. He rode away within the hour and did not return until after supper. When he came back, he chose to eat alone in his study instead of joining the family at the table. This was unusual enough that Cecily came to the kitchen to ask Dora whether something had been wrong with the meal. She seemed worried about Gerald and was searching for an explanation that did not require her to question him directly. Dora told her the food had been fine. Perhaps Mr. Haverfield had simply had a long day. Cecily looked at her with an expression that did not fully match her words, not quite the face of a woman asking only about dinner arrangements. Then she nodded and went back to the house. Dora stood at the stove, stirring the pot. She thought about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions. On the 9th of September, Philip left for New Orleans. This in itself was not unusual. He traveled there often, but the manner of his departure was different. He left early before breakfast, without the usual polite goodbyes to his mother, without giving instructions to the household staff, without any of the small rituals that usually marked his trips. He simply went. Dora learned of his departure from one of the girls working in the main house, who mentioned it in passing and asked whether she should still prepare his room. Dora told her to prepare it as usual. Then she stood for a moment, thinking about what Philip's sudden and quiet exit meant alongside everything else that was unfolding. She concluded that he sensed something coming and had decided that distance was his answer. In her long observation of him, Philip Haverfield was not a man who remained when matters grew difficult. He withdrew. He had been withdrawing for years, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in large ones. This was simply the clearest version of a pattern she had noticed since he had been old enough to make his own choices. On the 12th of September, Robert came into the kitchen. He did not come for food. He paused in the doorway and looked at her in a way he rarely did, not just glancing but truly seeing. He asked if she had a few minutes. She said she did. He stepped inside and sat at the corner of the work table, where the light from the window fell clearly. He was silent for a moment, then said something she would later write down in her own words in a letter sent through a channel she would not name, a letter that eventually became part of an archive. That is why we know what he said. He said, "Dora, I need you to understand that whatever happens in the next few weeks, I am going to make sure the people in the quarters know what they need to know to make the right choices." He paused, then added, "I need you to understand that I know it matters." She looked at him and asked, "What is going to happen in the next few weeks?" He studied his hands. He said, "I do not know all of it, but things are going to change." she replied. "Things always change, Mr. Robert." He looked up and said, "Not like this." She did not tell him about the pages. She thought about the 14-year-old boy in the stables who had written them, about the oilcloth, the false bottom, the oak chest, and the 15 years of empty space that had finally been used in the last month of summer. She said, "I know." He left, and she returned to the stove. On the 14th of September, 2 events took place. First, a stranger arrived at the plantation late in the morning, riding a hired horse and carrying a document that required Gerald Haverfield's signature. He had to be shown into the study, which meant Dora was told of his presence by the girl who managed the front door, so that Dora could prepare a tray of refreshments. Dora prepared the tray, carried it through the house, placed it on the hall table outside the study, and knocked. Gerald's voice called, "Come." She entered, set the tray down, and left. The entire action lasted no more than 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, she saw the stranger clearly. She noticed the document partly unrolled on Gerald's desk. She saw Gerald's face. The stranger was from Baton Rouge. She could not prove it absolutely, but she was almost certain, based on the small details she observed, a detail she would not explain without revealing more than she wished to reveal. It was something subtle but specific that told her where he had come from. Gerald's expression was that of a man receiving the thing he had feared, forced to accept it in front of another person, while hiding what he truly felt. She left the study, walked down the hallway, and returned to the kitchen. The second event of that day was that Cyrus Holt left Belhaven. He departed quietly in the afternoon with his horse and leather satchel. As far as Dora knew, he said goodbye to no one. He was simply present, and then he was gone, which itself carried meaning. The household seemed to hold its breath. Dora had never felt such tension in a place so strongly before, not even during the financial strain of 1853, or the sickness that swept through the quarters in 1855 and took 4 lives in 6 weeks. This felt different. This was not the ordinary hardship of plantation life. It was something deeper, something that would alter the shape of everything. She kept cooking. She continued walking the jasmine path. Each time she walked it, she listened through the open windows, which remained open because it was still September in Louisiana, and the heat had not yet eased. Gerald had grown quiet in a way that was unlike his usual reserve. He spent long hours in the study during the day and into the evening, which was not unusual in itself, but his presence in the house felt heavier now, denser, as though something unseen had settled over the rooms and would not lift concentration, the way the air grows thick before a storm finally breaks, and the house seemed heavier around him. Cecily was writing. She was writing more letters than Dora had ever known her to write, working at the parlor desk with a speed and steady flow that was striking. She sealed them herself and carried them to the front door on her own, and handed them to the houseboy to take into town, which was not her usual habit. Normally, she left outgoing correspondence on the front table. She was not using the regular post. Robert was gone most of the day. He left early and came back late, walking, instead of riding, and he entered through the rear door rather than the front, which told Dora something about where he had been, and more importantly, with whom. On the 18th of September, 3 men arrived who had not been invited for supper, yet they ended up seated in the dining room for 3 hours. Dora prepared the meal for them. She sent the dishes up through the back staircase as she always did. She waited in the kitchen while they ate and spoke in low, serious voices. When she returned to clear the table, the men were still sitting there. She moved through the room the way she always moved through any room, efficiently and quietly, without carrying the kind of presence that demands acknowledgement. She removed plates. She set down the dessert course. She refilled their glasses. The conversation continued around her with small changes, not a full pause, but a slight shift, a narrowing of what was said while she stood inside the room. This was the usual adjustment people made when she was nearby. It was a compromise between the wish to speak openly and the awareness that she could hear them, and it almost always settled in the same direction, as if her presence meant absence. She was not absent. What she caught in those brief silences and careful changes was the outline of a situation that by September of 1857 had grown into something she had not fully expected even. With everything she already knew, The document brought by the stranger on the 14th had not been what she first believed. It had not come from the man in Baton Rouge. It had come from somewhere else entirely. It concerned another part of Gerald Hatfield's arrangement, the part that involved August Fry. She heard the name. She heard it spoken with the same deliberate care she had first noticed in 1855, and now it had context. That context made the 2 years she had quietly carried that name feel suddenly and sharply important. August Fry was an agent. He worked in shifting ways, offering his loyalty where it suited him, serving several different interests. The interest he had most recently been serving had been investigating the arrangement between Gerald Hatfield and the men from New Orleans for nearly 2 years. She cleared the table and went back to the kitchen. She stood by the fire and thought about a name she had kept to herself for 2 long years and what it meant that it had finally shown its true shape. On the 22nd of September, Robert did not return home. He had left that morning as he usually did, walking out through the rear entrance, and by supper he was still gone. By the time the household closed for the night and the lamps were put out, he had not come back. Gerald did not send anyone to search for him. That detail told her more than anything else. In a house way, the heir's movements had always been watched with anxious care by parents who understood that their son's behavior affected the family's reputation. The lack of a search was not simple neglect. Gerald either knew where Robert was or understood in broad terms what had happened to him, and he had chosen, with whatever feeling guided him, to let the absence remain. She did not rest well that night. In the days that followed, the plantation continued to function on the surface as it always had. The cane was at a stage in the season that required close attention. The kitchen produced 3 meals each day. The household routine kept its usual rhythm. Yet beneath that surface, Dora felt the framework shifting. Cecily received a letter that caused her, for one long afternoon, to stop pretending. She sat in the parlor with the letter resting in her lap, her hands folded over it, and her face revealed something she did not manage to smooth back into its usual calm expression before Dora crossed the hall carrying a tray and saw her. Dora set the tray down and left without waiting to be dismissed, which was unusual, and Cecily did not call her back. October arrived. Philip did not return from New Orleans. Robert sent word, not to the main house but to the quarters, through channels that had their own quiet structure and efficiency, that he was safe, and that certain truths were known, and certain choices should now be made. Dora heard this not from Robert himself, but through others. In the way information traveled in parts of the plantation, the main house did not recognize as organized. Gerald Hatfield received more documents during October. Dora knew this from the steady flow of men carrying satchels through the front door and from the heaviness of Gerald's silence at the few meals he still ate in the dining room. He stopped riding out in the mornings. He stopped going into town. He remained on the property with the air of a man who was staying because he must, not because he wished to. Cyrus Hull did not return. In the first week of November, 2 men arrived carrying a document unlike the others. They were not from New Orleans. They were not men who handled the sort of private business long conducted in that study. They were officials, in the distinct way officials appeared in Louisiana in 1857. Their clothing, the way they sat on their horses, the formal manner in which they introduced themselves at the front door and asked to speak with Mr. Gerald Hatfield, all marked them clearly. Dora was in the kitchen when they came. She recognized their arrival by sound, the particular sound made by official men who carried documents, which differs from ordinary visitors. She did not walk the jasmine path that morning. She did not need to. She knew, with the deep certi of someone who has watched a pattern slowly complete itself, that what she had overheard through the open study window in June and July, and at the base of the back staircase, through an unlatched door, was now being heard by men who possessed the authority to act. She stood by her fire and felt something she examined carefully, because she could not at first name it. It was not exactly satisfaction. It was not quite vindication. It was something quieter and more complex. It felt like a record being set down. Gerald Hatfield left Belhaven in November of 1857, under circumstances that official documents of the time describe in the dry language of legal procedure. The details are not fully clear, as records of that period often carried the same gaps Dora had long noticed in the record of her own life. Facts were preserved when they served those who kept them, and left out when they did not. What the documents do show is that by early 1858, Belhaven was undergoing serious change. Legal actions had begun that over the following years led to results that were imperfect, as such outcomes often were in that place and era, but they were not meaningless. Robert Hatfield's name appears later in different records and in a different light. He is linked with people and causes his family would have condemned, and he seems to have continued along that path without visible concern for the judgment. Philip eventually returned to Louisiana, though not to Belhaven. Cicely went back to Virginia. The letters she had written to her sister in Richmond, arranged through a friend in Baton Rouge, and sent through a route that avoided the official post, later proved to have been part of a careful preparation for this exact outcome. Cicely Hatfield, with the same efficiency she applied to everything, had made her plans. She was a practical woman. Dora remained at Belhaven during the period of transition. This is made clear in later accounts, including a letter that reached an archive and was eventually connected through careful research in the 1970s and 80s to the pages themselves. She stayed because the kitchen needed to function, and the people in the quarters depended on it. The collapse of a plantation structure had specific consequences for those with the least protection within it, and she would not add to that burden by leaving. She cooked, she managed the kitchen, she made certain there was food, and she waited. The pages themselves were discovered in 1923. The kitchen house at what had once been the Belhaven Plantation had stood since the 1840s. It survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the long years after, like many outbuildings no longer used for their original purpose, sometimes repaired, slowly weathering, at times used for storage. The main house had burned in 1871. The cause was officially called accidental, though some local people had their own version of events that was never formally written down. The kitchen house did not burn. In 1923, a woman named Agnes Ter Rode, a schoolteacher in East Baton Rouge Parish and the granddaughter of a woman who had lived in the quarters at Belhaven and had been among those Dora cooked for during the transition, was helping clear the old structure before it was torn down, to make room for a new building on land that had changed owners several times since the 1860s. Agnes found the pages' dark chest. She discovered it because it was far too heavy to move without effort. And when she looked into the reason it was so heavy, she discovered the hidden insert. And when she lifted the insert out, she uncovered the empty space beneath it. And in that space below, she found the oiled cloth. And wrapped inside the oiled cloth she found the pages. She knew how to read. Her grandmother had made certain of that. She sat down on the floor of the old kitchen house with the papers resting in her lap, and she read every line. It took almost the whole afternoon. When she finished, she remained seated for a long time without moving in the dusty light of the old building, the pages still in her hands. Then she made a choice that would take years to fully carry out, that would force her to deal with institutions that were not prepared to receive what she had uncovered, that would cost her more time and effort and moments of quiet sorrow than she had imagined when she first sat on that floor. She decided that the pages would survive. Here is what we know and what we do not know, and the space between those two realities is where this story continues to exist. We know that Dora was real. Agnes Ter's written account of finding the pages, recorded in a journal she kept from the 1920s through the 1950s, is precise and detailed, and has been examined by experts who understand how to evaluate such material. The pages themselves, or more accurately photographs and typed transcriptions of them, because the originals are delicate and preserved under controlled conditions to protect their physical life, have been reviewed by scholars of Southern history, professional archivists and historians who specialize in that era. The question of authenticity has been carefully considered. The paper, the ink, and the handwriting are all consistent with the materials and techniques available in 1850s Louisiana. The writing shows the traits of someone largely self-taught, which matches Lenny's background. The content includes exact details, names, financial amounts, arrangements, and the name August Fry, all of which have been compared with other records from the same period. These official records were not accessible,